Some people count down the hours until they can leave. Others count down the hours until they can return. And for a certain kind of person, the moment they step through their own front door, something in them quietly settles, not from exhaustion, not from defeat, but from a deep, genuine sense of arrival. Psychology has been paying close attention to why. There is a pattern that behavioral researchers have observed consistently across different cultures, age groups, and lifestyles. A portion of the population reports their highest levels of contentment, clarity, and emotional comfort not during vacations, social gatherings, or public achievements, but during ordinary, quiet time spent at home. This is worth pausing on because the word happiest here carries real weight. Psychology suggests this is not about convenience or laziness. It is not simply the preference of someone having a bad week or recovering from burnout. Research indicates this reflects a stable psychological orientation, a consistent internal pull toward home as the primary environment where a person feels most like themselves. The distinction matters because society tends to pathologize this preference. A person who genuinely prefers an evening at home over a crowded social event is frequently misread as withdrawn, unmotivated, or struggling. But often observed behavior tells a different story. These individuals are frequently highly functioning, deeply creative, emotionally self-aware people who have simply discovered through lived experience where their inner life thrives best. To understand why some people feel most alive at home, psychology points towards several foundational factors, and they begin earlier than most people assume. Research on introversion, particularly the work built on Hans Eysenk's arousal theory, indicates that introverted individuals have a naturally higher baseline level of cortical arousal. In practical terms, this means the external world, noise, social demands, unpredictability, stimulates their nervous systems more intensely than it does those with extroverted tendencies. A social gathering that energizes one person can genuinely deplete another. This is not a character flaw. It is neurology. Alongside introversion, psychology also identifies sensory processing sensitivity as a significant factor. Research by psychologist Elaine Aron suggests that roughly 15 to 20% of the population processes sensory and emotional information at a deeper level than average. Bright lights feel brighter. Loud rooms feel louder. Emotional undercurrents in conversations register more clearly. For people with this trait, home is not a retreat in the negative sense, it is a calibration. It is the environment where their nervous system can stop working at full capacity and simply function at a human pace. There is also the dimension of attachment theory to consider. Psychologists working within this framework observe that the concept of a secure base, a safe, reliable environment from which a person can engage with the world, is not something that disappears in adulthood. For many people, home functions as that secure base throughout life. It is the place their emotional system recognizes as safe, and returning to it triggers a measurable physiological shift. Cortisol levels drop. Muscle tension eases. Cognitive clarity improves. The body recognizes home before the mind fully does. What psychology suggests about people who are happiest at home is that their inner world is unusually rich and active. This is a point frequently missed in cultural conversations about homebody tendencies. Often observed behavior in these individuals shows a strong relationship with their own thoughts. They tend to process experience internally and deeply. Where some people process emotion through conversation and social interaction, these individuals process it through reflection, through quiet thinking, writing, creating, or simply sitting with an experience until it makes sense. Home is not where they do nothing. It is where they do the kind of thinking most people never slow down long enough to do. Research in the psychology of solitude, particularly studies by psychologist Esther Buchholz and more recently by researchers at the University of Rochester, indicates that chosen voluntary solitude is associated with higher levels of creative output, emotional regulation, and self-awareness. The key word is chosen. When people spend time alone on their own terms in environments they control, the psychological benefits are measurable and significant. There is also something worth noting about the relationship these individuals have with predictability. Psychology suggests that environments which are familiar and controllable reduce cognitive load. When a person does not have to spend mental energy navigating social uncertainty, reading unfamiliar rooms, or managing the expectations of others, that energy becomes available foe. In work settings, these individuals often perform significantly better in environments with lower social interruption. Research on open-plan offices, for example, consistently shows that a segment of the workforce experiences dramatic productivity losses in high-stimulation environments, and corresponding gains when given privacy and quiet. The rise of remote work has functioned, for many of these individuals, not as a convenience, but as a genuine restoration of working conditions that match how their minds actually operate. In daily routines, psychology suggests home-oriented people tend to develop meaningful rituals around ordinary activities. The specific way they make coffee in the morning, the particular corner they read in, the order in which they move through their evenings. To an outside observer, these habits might seem unremarkable, but research in behavioral psychology indicates that consistent personal rituals serve a specific function. They signal safety to the nervous system. Each familiar action is a quiet message that says the environment is known, controlled, and stable. That message reduces anxiety in a way that is both measurable and cumulative. In social life, an often misunderstood pattern appears. People who are happiest at home are frequently described by those close to them as deeply present and attentive when they do engage socially, but highly selective about when and with whom they make that investment. Psychology suggests this is not coldness or arrogance, it is conservation. When social interaction requires significant energy expenditure, it follows naturally that a person would invest that energy carefully in connections that feel genuinely reciprocal and meaningful, rather than spreading it thinly across many surface-level interactions. There is a well-documented cultural bias in many societies toward extroversion. Psychologist Susan Cain's research brought this into mainstream conversation, pointing to what she described as an extrovert ideal, a cultural narrative in which sociability, visibility, and outward engagement are treated as markers of health, success, and moral virtue. Against that backdrop, the person who genuinely prefers to be at home is working against a current of social assumption. The most common misreading is that home orientation signals depression or social anxiety. And here, a careful distinction is necessary. Psychology is clear that social withdrawal driven by fear, avoidance, or low mood is clinically different from the settled, intentional choice to prioritize home environments. One pattern is driven by what a person is running from. The other is defined by what a person is drawn toward. The emotional signatures of these two states are entirely different, and research indicates that conflating them leads to significant misunderstanding of a large portion of the population. Another common misconception frames home-oriented people as unambitious or passive. This observation fails to account for the quality of interactivity that often occurs in solitude. Often observed behavior in creative fields, writing, design, research, music, philosophy, shows a consistent overrepresentation of people with strong solitary preferences. The work happens precisely because the noise is absent. The ideas form because the environment allows sustained, uninterrupted thought. What looks like stillness from the outside is frequently intense, intellectual, and emotional activity on the inside. The psychological effects of living in close alignment with a home-centered orientation are worth examining carefully, both for what they offer and for the challenges they carry. On the positive side, research indicates that people who spend meaningful time in chosen solitude tend to develop stronger emotional self-regulation over time. Because they are regularly in environments where their own feelings surface without distraction, they become practiced at recognizing and processing those feelings rather than suppressing them. This produces a kind of emotional literacy, an ability to identify internal states accurately and respond to them with intention rather than reaction. Creativity also appears to benefit measurably. Studies in cognitive psychology suggest that mind-wandering, the kind of unfocused, drifting thought that happens naturally in quiet, familiar environments, is closely associated with insight and creative problem-solving. The brain's default mode network, which activates during rest and reflection, plays a significant role in connecting ideas across distant mental domains. Home, for people who find it restorative, provides the conditions this network needs to function at its best. There are also challenges worth acknowledging honestly. Psychology suggests that a strong preference for home environments, when it is not balanced with some degree of external engagement, can gradually narrow a person's world. Comfort unchecked can shade into avoidance without. One of the more counterintuitive findings in the psychology of home-oriented people is the quality of their relationships. The assumption that preferring solitude produces social deficiency turns out to be largely unsupported by research. What psychology suggests instead is that people who are highly selective with their social energy tend to invest that energy more deeply when they do form connections. They are less interested in the performance of friendship, the regular check-ins, the surface-level updates, the social maintenance that characterizes many acquaintance-level relationships, and more oriented toward the kind of connection where two people can exist in genuine honesty with each other. Often observed in these relationships is a high tolerance for comfortable silence, a preference for meaningful conversation over small talk, and a pattern of showing up with unusual attentiveness when it matters. These individuals frequently report that their closest relationships feel more like home than like social obligation, and that is a meaningful phrase because it reveals how they experience connection at its best. Not as performance or duty, but as an extension of the same safety and authenticity they find in their own spaces. In romantic partnerships, this can create friction when one person is strongly home-oriented and the other has more outward social needs. Psychology suggests the most sustainable resolution in these dynamics is not for either person to override their natural orientation, but to develop genuine understanding of what each partner's social behavior actually means. The home-oriented partner's preference for staying in is rarely a statement about their feelings for the other person. It is simply the condition under which they are most fully themselves. It would be incomplete to discuss this topic without acknowledging how significantly the external landscape has shifted in recent years. The widespread normalization of remote work has created, for the first time in modern professional culture, a broad social permission to be productive, successful, and engaged from home. Research conducted in the years following the global shift to remote work consistently found that a substantial segment of the workforce not only maintained productivity at home, but significantly exceeded their previous output, and reported corresponding improvements in psychological well-being. For home-oriented individuals, this was not a crisis to adapt to. It was a confirmation of something they had always known about themselves. Digital communication has also reshaped what social connection looks like for this group. Psychology suggests that for people who find large social gatherings draining but crave genuine intellectual and emotional exchange, online communication in its more deliberate forms, written conversation, small group interaction, asynchronous communication, can provide real connection without the sensory and social demands of in-person group settings. This is not a lesser form of connection. For many people, it is simply a better matched one. What is also notable is that a cultural conversation has begun to emerge around the validity of slower, quieter living. Psychology suggests this is not merely a trend, but a recognition, gradually becoming more visible, that the extrovert ideal was never a complete picture of what human flourishing looks like. A growing body of research on well-being indicates that contentment is not a function of social activity levels, but of alignment between a person's natural orientation and the conditions of their daily life. The psychology of people who feel happiest at home, examined carefully, reveals something that extends well beyond any single personality type or lifestyle preference. It reveals that human beings have genuinely different relationships with stimulation, solitude, and social energy, and that these differences are not deviations from a norm, but expressions of the actual range of human psychological design. It reveals that the cultural pressure to be perpetually outward, perpetually visible, perpetually social comes with real costs for a significant portion of the population. Costs that often go unnamed because the dominant cultural narrative does not have a flattering language for stillness. And perhaps most importantly, it reveals that contentment, real, sustained, not dependent on circumstances contentment, is less about what surrounds a person and more about whether a person is living in alignment with who they actually are. For some people, that alignment is found in motion, noise, and constant connection. For others, it is found in the quiet constancy of a familiar space, the freedom to think without an audience, and the particular peace that comes from a life built around depth rather than breadth. Psychology does not rank these orientations. It observes them, and what the observation shows is that the person who steps through their front door at the end of the day and feels genuinely, completely at ease is not missing out on life. They are in their own way fully inside it. If something in this discussion reflected your own experience or gave you a different way of thinking about someone you know, that is worth sitting with. The questions that stay with us after a quiet conversation are often the ones that matter most. Share your thoughts in the comments, not a reaction but a reflection. What does home actually mean to you?